He married her before the sun was a rumor in the east, with the snow falling so thick it muffled the sound of his own words. The preacher, a circuit rider caught by the same sudden blizzard, shivered in his thin coat, his gaze flickering between the mountain of a man before him and the tiny, silent woman at his side. The only other witness was a great golden dog, whose tail beat a soft, rhythmic thump against the rough-hewn floorboards of the cabin. There was no ring, only a solemn nod from the man, and a silence from the woman that was taken as assent. The ink on the marriage certificate was barely dry when the preacher, fortified with coffee and a slab of bacon, was on his way, leaving Josiah Thorne alone with his new wife. He didn't even know her name. It had started hours earlier, in the dead of a night that had forgotten the moon. The wind was a living thing, clawing at the stout log walls of Josiah's isolated homestead, a place carved from the high mountain timber with his own 2 hands. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the contented sighs of Barley, his dog, who was asleep at his feet. It was Barley who heard it first. A low whine, a shift of his heavy body, then a single, sharp bark that cut through the storm's howl. Josiah stilled, his hand resting on the dog's broad head. Barley wasn't a frivolous barker. He was the most practical creature Josiah knew, saving his voice for things that mattered, a bear nosing the smokehouse, a buck in the clearing, or something deeply out of place. Josiah pulled on his heavy coat and boots, lit the lantern, and took a rifle from the pegs by the door. The cold hit him like a physical blow, the air so sharp it felt as if it were freezing his lungs solid. Snow swirled in the lantern light, a blinding chaos of white. Barley plunged ahead, his golden coat a brief flare against the darkness before he disappeared toward the barn. Josiah followed, his boots sinking deep with each step. The barn was his sanctuary, a place of quiet order and the familiar sense of hay and horses. But tonight, the order was broken. Barley stood whining at the door to an empty stall, his nose pressed to the crack. Josiah raised the lantern. Curled into a tight ball in the corner, nestled deep in the clean straw, was a person. A woman. She was impossibly small, dressed in what looked like a prairie dress, once white but now tattered and stained with the grime of a long journey. It was a garment for a warmer world, wholly inadequate for the mountain's brutal winter. Her hair was a black river against the pale straw, and her face, when he knelt closer, was pale with a cold that seemed to have settled into her very bones. She wasn't moving. For a terrible moment, he thought he was too late, that the mountain had already claimed another soul. But then, a faint cloud of breath ghosted in the frigid air. She was alive. Barely. He did not think. He simply acted. He was a huge man, with shoulders wide as an axe handle and hands calloused from a life of hard labor, but he gathered her up as if she weighed nothing at all. She was a frozen bird in his arms. He carried her back to the cabin, the wind tearing at them, Barley flanking his side like a loyal guard. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a shock. He laid her on the bearskin rug before the hearth, his mind a blank slate of pure, animal instinct. Warmth. She needed warmth. He worked methodically, stripping off her frozen, damp dress and wrapping her in the thickest wool blankets he owned. He chafed her hands and feet, his rough touch surprisingly gentle, trying to force life back into her limbs. Her eyes fluttered open once, dark and disoriented, before closing again. He sat with her for a long time, feeding the fire, watching the slow return of color to her cheeks, listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet, steady rhythm of her breathing within. When dawn threatened, and the circuit preacher had knocked on his door seeking shelter, Josiah had looked from the sleeping woman to the man of God and made a decision. He lived alone. She was a woman, alone. The mountain was a hard place, but society had its own unforgiving weather. A marriage, even one of paper and necessity, was a shelter of a different kind. It was the only honorable thing he could think to do. The morning after the hasty wedding was a study in silence. Josiah rose at his usual hour, long before the sun, and moved about the cabin with the quiet economy of a man long accustomed to his own company. He stoked the fire, put the coffee on to boil, and sliced bacon into his cast-iron skillet. The smell filled the small space, a familiar comfort that felt alien in the presence of another. His bride was awake. She sat on the edge of his cot, still wrapped in his blankets, watching him with eyes so dark they seemed to hold the night they had just survived. She was even smaller than he'd thought, her frame delicate, her hands like tiny, folded leaves in her lap. He felt monstrously large in his own home, his every movement a potential threat. He did not know the right words, so he used the only ones he had. "There's coffee," he said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured to the pot. She simply nodded, her gaze unwavering. He served up 2 plates of bacon and eggs, setting one on the small table. He sat, and after a moment of hesitation, she rose and joined him, her movements graceful and contained. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every bite. Barley, who usually sat at Josiah's feet, padded over to her side and rested his heavy head on her knee. She flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders, before her hand came down to rest tentatively on the dog's soft fur. Josiah watched the exchange. Barley was an excellent judge of character. Josiah's life was a routine, a bulwark against the crushing solitude of the mountains. After breakfast, he would check his trap lines, chop wood, tend to his 2 horses. It was a life of physical exertion and deep quiet. He had come to these heights years ago to escape a world that had taken everything from him, leaving only a hollow ache where his family used to be. The silence had been a balm at first, but over the years, it had become its own kind of burden. Now, that silence was shared. He didn't know if that made it better or worse. He pulled on his coat. "I have chores," he announced to the room. He expected her to stay by the fire, a fragile guest. But as he stepped outside, he saw her emerge from the cabin, wrapped in one of his old, oversized coats. The sleeve swallowed her hands, the hem dragged in the snow. She looked absurd, a child playing dress-up, but her expression was one of serious intent. She followed him to the woodpile, watched as he swung the heavy axe, the clean crack of splitting logs echoing in the cold air. When he stopped to rest, she gathered the split pieces, her movements deft and efficient, and began stacking them neatly against the cabin wall. She didn't ask. She just did. One small thing at a time. This became the pattern of their days. He worked his world, and she began to inhabit it, finding the broken seams and quietly mending them. She found his mending basket, a neglected tangle of thread and spare buttons. The next evening, he found a shirt he'd torn on a branch weeks ago lying folded on his cot, the rip stitched so perfectly it was nearly invisible. He held it up to the lamplight, marveling at the tiny, even stitches. It was like a line of careful script, a language he didn't speak but was beginning to understand. She cleaned the cabin with a quiet ferocity, not just sweeping the floor but scrubbing it, chasing the dust from corners that hadn't been disturbed in years. She organized his larder, her small hands taking inventory of his dwindling supplies, arranging the sacks of flour and beans with an order that shamed his own haphazard methods. She never spoke unless spoken to, and her answers were always brief, her English halting but clear. He learned her name was Fen. Just Fen. She had come from a place across the ocean, a place of hunger, she said. She had been promised a husband, a new life. She did not speak of the man who was supposed to meet her, or how she had ended up alone and freezing in a blizzard. The questions hung in the air between them, but Josiah did not ask. He had his own ghosts. He would not pry at hers. The wound of his own past had made him cautious of the wounds of others. His small cabin, once a fortress of solitude, was slowly, imperceptibly changing. It was becoming cleaner, warmer. It was becoming a home. Barley was the first to surrender completely. Josiah had been the dog's entire world, the source of all food, warmth, and affection. At first, Barley had been watchful of Fen, keeping a respectful distance, observing her as she moved through their shared space. Fen, in turn, never pushed. She seemed to understand the dog's loyalty. She would speak to him sometimes in her own language, a soft, musical cadence that made Barley's ears twitch. She would save a small scrap of bacon for him from her own plate, offering it on a flat palm. One afternoon, Josiah came in from the cold, stamping the snow from his boots, and stopped dead in the doorway. The cabin was warm and filled with the scent of baking bread, a smell he hadn't known in years. Fen was sitting on the floor by the hearth, her back against the warm stones, her hands busy with some mending. And curled up beside her, with his great golden head resting peacefully in her lap, was Barley. The dog's eyes were closed in a state of perfect bliss as her fingers gently scratched behind his ears. He didn't even stir at Josiah's entrance. Seeing his steadfast companion so utterly given over, so content in her care, struck a place deep inside Josiah that he thought had long since frozen over. It was a simple, domestic scene, yet it felt like a profound shift, a quiet verdict delivered by the most honest member of his household. The dog had decided. Fen belonged. Josiah began to answer her silent acts of care with his own. He noticed her thin, worn shoes, the same ones she'd arrived in, were cracking from the constant cycle of wet and dry. They offered little protection from the cold. He said nothing, but that evening, he took down a cured piece of deerskin and his awl. By the flickering light of the fire, he began to work. His hands, accustomed to the brute force of an axe or the precision of setting a snare, were clumsy with the needle and sinew. He measured her abandoned shoes with his thumb, guessing at the size. It took him 2 nights, his brow furrowed in concentration, Barley watching him with curious eyes. When he was finished, he left the pair of soft, sturdy moccasins on the floor by the cot where she slept. He was outside before she woke, feeling a strange, unfamiliar flush of something like shyness. When he returned for lunch, she was wearing them. She didn't say thank you, but as she moved about the cabin, her steps were now silent on the floorboards. That was thanks enough. One day, he found her looking out the small window at the bleak, snow-covered landscape, her expression one of deep, unreadable melancholy. Later, he took out his whittling knife and a block of pine. He worked until he held a small, smooth bird in his palm, its form simple but elegant. He sanded it with a piece of leather until it was silk to the touch and left it on the mantelpiece. He never saw her touch it, but he noticed it was often turned in a new direction, as if she had been holding it, studying it, before placing it back. It was a conversation held in objects, a language of things made and mended, of needs met without a word being spoken. He kept the wood box filled to overflowing. He started bringing her the first cup of coffee in the morning. Small things. One small thing at a time. The snows began to recede, and the world outside the cabin slowly reappeared. The first sign of trouble arrived not with a shout, but with a piece of paper. Fen kept a small, folded document tucked into the sleeve of her dress. Josiah had glimpsed it before, but had paid it no mind. One evening, as she was adding wood to the stove, it slipped from its hiding place and fell to the floor. He bent to retrieve it, his large fingers fumbling with the delicate paper. Before he could hand it back, his eyes caught a name written in a neat, clerical hand, Silas Bishop. Beneath it was a column of figures, sums of money paid. He recognized Bishop's name. He was a deacon in a small town at the foot of the mountain, a man known for his piety and his business of connecting settlers with mail-order brides from the east. But the numbers on the page seemed wrong, too large for a simple passage fee. Fen snatched the paper from his hand, her movement swift and startled. A flicker of genuine fear crossed her face before she tucked it away again. "It is nothing," she whispered, and turned back to the stove. But it wasn't nothing. The fear in her eyes was real. The incident planted a seed of unease in Josiah. Bishop was a man of standing, of scripture and firm handshakes. But the look on Fen's face spoke of something else entirely. A few days later, Josiah had to ride into town for supplies. He tied his horse outside the general store and saw Bishop himself, exiting the church across the street. The man was dressed in a severe black coat, his face a mask of pleasant respectability. He nodded to Josiah. "Mr. Thorne. Good to see you down from your mountain. The Lord has seen us through another winter." Josiah just nodded back, his hand tightening on his saddlebag. The deacon's smile didn't reach his eyes. The memory of the numbers on that paper, and the terror on Fen's face, felt like a cold stone in his gut. Something was wrong. The false spring of early March was a liar. Just as the first patches of brown earth began to show, the sky turned a bruised, metallic gray. A new storm rolled in, bigger and more vicious than the one that had brought Fen to his door. For 10 days, the world was nothing but a howling vortex of wind and snow. They were completely cut off. The path to town was impassable, his trap lines buried under 6 feet of fresh powder. For the first time in years, Josiah felt the cold finger of real fear. His supplies, already low, were now dangerously finite. He began rationing, cutting their portions in half. He ate his own small meal standing up, his face a grim mask of worry. He was responsible for her now. It was a weight he hadn't carried in a long time. It was in this crucible of hunger and isolation that Fen truly came into her own. She had been watching the land with a different set of eyes. One afternoon, she bundled herself in his coat and, taking a shovel, began digging at the base of a great oak tree near the cabin. Josiah watched from the window, mystified. She returned with her apron full of hard, wrinkled knobs. Roots, she explained, holding one up. Good for soup. She boiled them until they were soft, adding the last of their salt and a handful of dried herbs she had found hanging in the barn. The resulting stew was thin, but it was hot, nourishing, and it filled their bellies. She showed him how to find the tender inner bark of a pine tree, which, when scraped and roasted, had a strange, sweet taste. She had a knowledge of survival that ran deeper than his own, a knowledge born not of rugged independence, but of desperate scarcity. She had seen real famine, and she had learned its lessons well. She moved through the crisis with a quiet, unshakable calm, her competence a steadying force against the storm's fury. They were no longer a man and his accidental wife, they were a partnership, a tiny fortress of two against the mountain's wrath. The enforced intimacy of the blizzard wore down the walls between them. The cabin, once a space of silent cohabitation, became a shared world. In the long evenings, with the wind shrieking outside, the silence changed. It was no longer empty, but full of unspoken history. One night, as they sat by the fire, the only light in the vast, stormy darkness, Josiah finally asked the question that had been sitting on his heart for weeks. "Fen," he said, the name still feeling new on his tongue. "Why did you come here?" She was quiet for a long time, her hands clasped in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was low, her English careful. She told him of her home, a village where the rains had failed for 2 years. She spoke of her family, of a father who sold her not with a cruel heart, but with a broken one, hoping to give his daughter a chance at a life with food in her belly. She was one of several girls from her region, all promised to men in this new land by the pious Mr. Bishop, who had come through their villages with a Bible in one hand and contracts in the other. Her story was simple, brutal, and told without a trace of self-pity. The quiet acceptance of her fate was more heartbreaking than any tears would have been. Hearing her story unlatched something in him. He found himself speaking of things he hadn't uttered in a decade. He told her about his wife, Mary, and their son, Daniel. He told her how he had built this cabin for them, how they were supposed to fill it with laughter. He spoke of the fever that had swept through the valley, taking them both in the space of a week, leaving him with nothing but a silence that had nearly driven him mad. He had come up the mountain to outrun their ghosts, but had only ended up living with them. In the warm, flickering light of the fire, surrounded by the storm, two solitary people shared the architecture of their grief. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by a piece of paper. They were two survivors, each marked by loss, who had found an unlikely harbor in each other. When the great storm finally broke and the world began to thaw, trouble rode up the muddy path to the cabin. Josiah was splitting wood when he saw the horseman approaching. It was Silas Bishop. He was not alone. 2 other men, strangers to Josiah, flanked him. Bishop dismounted, his boots sinking into the wet earth. He smiled his thin, bloodless smile. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice carrying an oily pleasantness. "A difficult winter. I trust you've been well." Josiah simply rested his hand on his axe handle and waited. "I've come about a piece of my property," Bishop continued, his gaze flicking toward the cabin door, where Fen had appeared, her face pale. "There has been a most unfortunate misunderstanding. This woman, she was not intended for you. A clerical error." she was promised to another man, a respected landowner in the next county. I am here to rectify the situation. He spoke of her as if she were a misplaced parcel, a sack of grain delivered to the wrong address. The insult was so profound it stole the air from Josiah's lungs. A cold, quiet rage began to build in his chest. "She is my wife," Josiah said, his voice dangerously low. Bishop laughed, a dry, rustling sound. "A marriage of convenience, I'm sure. A kindness on your part to shelter her. But a contract is a contract. The law is on my side. I have the paperwork." He patted a leather satchel at his side. "I will overlook your presumption, Mr. Thorne. Give her to us now, and we can forget this ever happened." Fen had stepped outside now, and she stood not behind Josiah, but beside him. Her hand, small and trembling, came to rest on his forearm. It was the first time she had ever touched him voluntarily. The simple gesture was an anchor, a declaration. "She is not going anywhere," Josiah said. Bishop's smile vanished. "I see. I had hoped to handle this with Christian charity. But if you insist on being difficult, I will return with the sheriff. Do not force my hand, Thorne." He mounted his horse, his men following suit, and they rode away, leaving a trail of threats hanging in the clean mountain air. Josiah knew Bishop would be back. He spent the next 2 days in a state of quiet readiness, his rifle always within arm's reach. He did not speak of his fear to Fen, but she saw it in the hard set of his jaw, in the way he watched the path. She, too, was preparing. On the second evening, she approached him as he sat cleaning his rifle. She held out the folded piece of paper he had seen before. "Mr. Thorne," she began, then stopped. Josiah using his given name was an act of profound intimacy. "This is not a contract. It is a ledger." She unfolded it. In her neat, careful hand, she had made a copy. The original, she explained, was hidden. The document showed Silas Bishop's true business. He had taken payment not from one man for one bride, but from 10 different men for Fen alone. He was promising the same woman to multiple suitors, collecting their money, and then, she suspected, planning to sell her to the highest bidder while making excuses to the others. She had been left in the storm not by accident, but by design. It was easier than explaining where his promised bride had gone. The man was not a deacon, he was a predator, using the desperation of lonely men and abandoned women to line his pockets. As promised, Bishop returned the next day with the town sheriff, a weary-looking man named Hobbs. They rode up to the cabin, and Bishop dismounted with an air of smug victory. "Sheriff," he said, "this man is illegally holding my ward." Josiah met them at the door. He did not raise his voice. He simply invited the sheriff inside. Fen was standing by the hearth, calm and composed. "Sheriff Hobbs," Josiah said, his voice steady. "This man left my wife to die in a snowstorm in my barn. I found her near frozen alive." Bishop sputtered. "She ran off." "Then perhaps you can explain this," Josiah said. Fen stepped forward and handed the copied ledger to the sheriff. She explained, in her clear, simple English, what the numbers meant. She pointed to the names, the dates, the sums paid. It was a meticulous record of fraud. "The original is safe," she added quietly. Sheriff Hobbs studied the paper, then looked at Bishop, whose face had gone pale. He looked at Fen's quiet dignity, at the towering, protective presence of Josiah beside her. He had known Josiah Thorne for years as a silent, grieving man who kept to himself. He had known Silas Bishop as a man who was always too loud about his own piety. "Bishop," the sheriff said, his voice flat. "It seems to me you've got some explaining to do." Down in town, the authority in Bishop's posture collapsed. He was no longer a righteous deacon, but a common swindler, finally seen for what he was. He was defeated not by violence, but by a small woman's careful bookkeeping and a quiet man's resolve. After the sheriff had led a protesting bishop away, the silence that fell in the cabin was different. It was not empty. It was peaceful. Fen walked to the small bundle she had kept packed by the door since the day she arrived, her one small bag of belongings, her exit always ready. Josiah crossed the room in 2 strides. He gently took the bundle from her hands. He walked to the large wooden chest at the foot of his cot, a chest that had held his wife Mary's things for 10 years, untouched. He opened it, and for the first time, placed something new inside. He placed Fenn's bag within it, and closed the lid. He turned back to her. The air was thick with everything they had never said. "Fen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It was all he said. Her name. But in it, she heard the word stay, she heard the word home, she heard the bargain ending, and the marriage beginning. A small, brilliant smile, the first he had ever truly seen, lit up her face. The mountain was still a hard place, but they would face it together. Thank you for watching.